Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Valerie Leva. I'm a clinical supervisor for Stain County BHRS. This is an intern and associate's training on loss and bereavement. So let me share my screen so we can look at the PowerPoint. Okay, that should be visible to you right now. We're going to skip the live training issues. So we're going to talk about grief, loss, and bereavement and put some definitions to them. Grief is the experience of coping with loss. A lot of times, I think in English, grief has been associated with the death of a loved one, and that's actually the definition of bereavement. Specifically refers to the experience of grief and loss after the death of a loved one. So we're going to talk about grief, loss, and bereavement rather broadly, but that's what I mean when I use these particular terms. The learning objectives for today are to understand how loss and bereavement may impact pre-existing mental health issues, particularly since we see a moderate to severe mental illness spectrum in our clinics. And we're also going to learn a couple of models for helping clients live with the loss, begin to move forward, talk about different kinds of loss, changes in agency and identity as well. So I have a couple of big caveats or big hang-ons when discussing bereavement, in particular bereavement, grieving the loss of a loved one. This is very idiosyncratic from person to person. Everybody does this differently. What I used to tell clients was you grieve the way you grieve, whether it's loss of a loved one or loss of a job or loss of a pet, a loss of fertility or a dream or a goal. How you grieve is different from person to person. And it takes however long the client needs it to. Now, there are some definitions in the DSM about prolonged grief, and I have a bias about it. I'll be honest. It's like, how long does grief need to take? Prolonged grief really is about folks who are unable to resume activities of daily living and their regular life activities. And there is a place for that. And we remember that the DSM is a roadmap for us, but it's also used for medical billing. And so there has to be a way to access resources for somebody for the assistance they need when they have prolonged grief. But grief in itself is very, very much driven by cultural practices. And, culture, the big cultures we talk about when we're talking about diversity, but also culture of the family or culture of the military or other aspects of a culture or group of people who believe a certain way. For instance, in this video, or actually in this picture, I have a picture of flowers and candles. From my cultural background as Anglo-American, most of my ancestors are from Northern Europe. This is a typical way to denote grief. Also, in my religious perspective, people tend to bring casseroles to the family who is bereaved. My mother-in-law, who is culturally very different from me, said, "Why do white people keep bringing us casseroles? We don't eat that stuff." So it's interesting. It can be amusing sometimes, but you really have to lean into the cultural aspect of bereavement and grief when talking to individuals. That being said, there is sort of some typical activities or processes that happen during bereavement as defined by most research on the topic. First, there's a yearning for the lost loved one. This sense of loss, emptiness. Oh my gosh, you just turn and like you're going to ask them a question, you're going to think, oh, I can call her and tell her something. Those kinds of things happen. And you just really want to be able to be near the person, smell what they used to smell like, feel how they used to feel, etc. Whether it's a spouse, a very good friend, a child, an extended family member, a parent, that yearning for the lost loved one is one of the primary signs of bereavement. Then in most people, there's an onset of very transient trauma-like symptoms, particularly in the first couple of weeks. There's problem with short-term memory. Can't find your keys, can't find your glasses, can't find your wallet. It's that short-term memory isn't storing properly, so you can't retrieve it when you're overcome with this longing for the lost loved one. There's difficulties with decision making, and this is a part of an executive functioning process. And frequently in counseling, we tell people don't make a big decision when you're grieving, when you're actively grieving someone, because literally you're not in your typical mind. You're in a different state of mind because of the hormones and neurochemicals that are being activated through the grieving process. So put off big decisions. You'll see a lot of emotional lability, which means emotions up and down in the same day. So somebody might go from crying to laughing or laughing to crying very quickly, particularly when they're recalling episodes or memories of the lost loved one. Some folks will isolate. This is not across the board, but be mindful of isolation in folks who've lost a loved one. And then reminiscing, thinking about the good episodes or the bad episodes with the person who has just passed away. This is very helpful in the healing process. For example, one of my brothers died a long time ago, like 15 years ago, but he was a very well-known surfer and surf photographer in the southeastern US and in Central America. And he was also a sports fisherman and was affiliated with a sports fishing company. So he was an unconventional guy. We were not going to do a church. We weren't going to do a funeral. We weren't going to do church. We wanted a meal where everybody could get together and just talk about the stories. And so we had about 300 people at a house that somebody loaned us that had the capacity for that. People who'd known him at different parts of his life and people who loved him and told the most amazing stories, many of which I'd never heard. So that was a very healing process. And that is a lot of some of the rituals of some religions, such as a eulogy, talking about the loved one, getting together to have a meal, doing the grieving process if you're Buddhist with the 7 days after the death preceding the funeral and having a monk come over. I know in some Filipino cultures, it's a rosary a night for 30 nights after the person's passed. So this coming together in community is what really facilitates healing and hopefully is a part of the healing process for most folks. Think about, though, folks who are socially isolated, folks who might be homeless, cut off from their families. We'll talk about that a little bit later because they have a hidden type of grief that we really need to help them process. So, the current working theory of the goals of bereavement focus on loss-focused tasks and restoration-focused tasks. So a loss-focused task is any activity regarding engagement of stimuli that triggers the reality of the loss. So this is planning for a funeral, telephoning people, posting on Facebook, clearing out a closet, donating clothes, seeing their toothbrush in the bathroom, right? These are all loss-focused tasks. And it's emotionally taxing work, right? You constantly have these triggers of memories of the loss. And so you go through this kind of ping pong or tennis match effect of moving between echoes of the past and present focused activities. So yeah, I got to brush my teeth to go to work, but there's my spouse's toothbrush sitting next to mine. So it's this back and forth and moving in and out of those loss focused tasks. Restoration focused tasks are those that is the restoration of everyday life functions that depended critically on the lost loved one. After my mom passed, it was hilarious getting calls from my dad about how do you bake a cake. My mom did all the cooking, and he all of a sudden had to cook for himself. And he, I think, lived on Pepperidge Farm cakes and fish sticks in the air fryer for the next 10 years, right? So it's cooking and household chores people need to do. Maybe one partner did all the finances and you've got to pick up the financial stuff. Maybe you've got to go out and get a job, or the grieving person needs to find new sources of social and emotional support and companionship. So as they move through the loss focused tasks, they will then move into restoration focused tasks. And when they can go back and forth through these tasks without being triggered to the extent that they don't function anymore, they can't move on to their next activity, that's really the resolution of the active grieving process. This is not to say that you're over grieving. Some people never lose a sense of loss from that person. My mom passed nearly 20 years ago, and every now and again I'll have that flash, oh, I should call mom and tell her. And then I realize, oh, I can't do that, right? So it's even a millisecond. I don't even have those words formed in my head, but it's like, bing, dong, oh yeah, she's not there. Particularly the loss of a significant relationship, like a parent, a spouse, or a child. I would never say to a client, have you completed that grieving process? I would just say, what are you ready to move on to at this point in time? So let's talk for a minute about when does bereavement end, when a combination of loss and restorative tasks are completed, when the surviving individual comes to the acceptance of the reality of the loss. It's not acceptance of the loss, but acceptance of this has really happened and I have to figure out how to move forward. And then when they re-engage with life, with work, social activities, their activities they were doing before the person passed, that is technically from a psychological perspective when bereavement ends. Um, but I want us all to give people grace to say, I'm never done grieving the loss of a loved one. So that being said, oh my goodness, we are in the Central Valley. Holy cow. I can't even begin to list all the cultures and languages and religions and spiritualities that are contained in the Central Valley. I tried to find a mosaic image to use, and this was the one that I found. Golly, we're Mexican, Mexican American, African American, Indigenous from the US and from other countries, Filipino, Hmong, Chinese, Vietnamese, Pakistani, Indian, Hindu, Catholic, Mormon, LGBT, et cetera, age-rated loss, gender-related loss. My gosh, there's so many. So what I wanted to do was to have a short discussion. And since we're not live, I'm just going to ask you to think about it. What are some of the ways that bereavement is experienced in your culture? Think about that. What does your culture do, whether it's your family, your ethnicity, your race, your religion, your social group? What are some of the ways that bereavement is experienced and expressed in your culture? And think about how different that might be from someone else's culture. In some cultures, it's expected to have volumes of emotional expression. In other cultures, it's expected to pull in and draw back and not express those emotions. In some cultures, the person has to be buried according to a ritual within a particular time frame. In other cultures, that's not the expectation. So think about how different your particular culture is from the others that you know of around you. And then think for a minute how you're going to formulate questions to find out the client's bereavement practices. So now I'm switching a little bit from bereavement to all kinds of loss because we've got to get to that cultural component. What are the basic culturally relevant practices that your client engages in? And that's a place to start. It's a starting point for addressing all kinds of loss or grief as it's defined in the DSM. We can talk about loss of a job, a home, a relationship, a health status, a mental health status, dreams, goals, money, pets, meaningful objects, sense of independence, a loss of role. I really struggled when I left full-time teaching because I thought, my gosh, I've been doing this for 20 years. And I tried retirement. Didn't like it, came back to work in about 6 months. My loss of role was severe, and I wasn't at an age where I thought that that was something that I wanted to address at that point in time. I wasn't ready to give up that role, so I came back to work. So remember to use open-ended questions, the who, what, when, where, and how, to get at what are those practices and what are the meanings for the client. I tend to ask questions like, well, what do you need to do in the first days and weeks of a loss? Well, what do you need to do to get back to work, get out of bed in the morning, help get your kids to school every day, remember the person, that kind of thing. I'll ask questions about, tell me how your family, culture, etc., addresses this kind of loss. How is your experience of that different from that group? What are some things you need to do to remember that person by? What resources do you need? Do you need a picture of them or something that they used to hold themselves or something else? So ask those really definitional, open-ended questions to get as much detail as you can from the person. And then help them figure out how to do more of what it is they want to do, to remember that person or that thing, or to process what they've lost. Always engage in client-centered practices such as the strengths model, unconditional positive regard, client-directed goals, etc. and always ground that grieving experience in the client's family, culture, spiritual or personally meaningful practices. So you've got to do a little bit of digging to find out that information. And because we're not live, we're not doing a role play, but I want you to think through, take some time to think through how you would do this. Decide if you're going to be the counselor in this one. You're not going to be the client or the observer, but pick a scenario: death of a loved one, loss of a job, breakup of a significant relationship. So, how would you, as the counselor, ask questions about how your client is coping right now? What are those open-ended questions you're going to ask to get the answers to how are you coping right now? What are you doing? What do you need to do more of? Think about questions you can ask to find out how and what they're engaging in regarding these cultural, spiritual, meaningful practices that is helping them deal with this loss. So, what kind of open ended questions are you going to use to ask the client and to get that information from the client? And this needs, as you practice this and rehearse this, which is a good learning skill, you need to remember to make it a conversation rather than just asking questions. It's not, you're not grilling them for information. It's not a police interview. It's not even an assessment, really. It's about really trying to get at that information so that you can reaffirm, right, that information. You can summarize it, you can paraphrase it, and even write it down for the client. I'm big on writing it down for the client's phone and sending them the file or using an index card. Really make sure that you're embedding and grounding this grieving experience in their culture and what's meaningful to them. So take some time to do that. Okay, so for recent or acute losses, especially in the first 24 to 48 hours or the first few days, you really need to use crisis intervention and crisis stabilization skills. Um, a lot of time, hopefully you've already taken that training. I know I've done a little bit of this kind of training earlier in the year. For crisis intervention, it's like, how are you feeling right now? What do you need to do right now? What do you need to do for the next 48 hours? Make a list. Help them get through those cognitive tasks that they're so overwhelmed with emotion they can't click into their cognitive and executive functioning. So make sure you focus on those tasks. And I really tell people, golly, especially with the death of a loved one or a family member, loss affects others in your family and your social circle, and expect that everybody grieves differently. The way you grieve is not going to be even how your sibling grieves, or maybe how your daughter-in-law grieves, or if it's a loss of somebody at work, how are we going to do this at work in a way that's culturally okay for all of us to talk about our grief? Sometimes in families, you will have a lot of emotional disruption. Some family members may be able to self regulate and others will not. And I tell people, all bets are off in a grieving circumstance, particularly around death of a family member. Um, go to the people for support that are actively supporting you. Don't forget to set basic boundaries with people who are really interfering with your grieving process. That's okay to do. You can mend fences later. Unfortunately, grieving around a loved one is a time when people cut themselves off or they burn bridges with their family because it's such an emotionally acute period of time. So just prep people for that and make sure that they are aware that that may well happen. So certainly there are issues that complicate bereavement and loss. And I put up the ones, did some research into the ones that are typical for the clients that we see at BHRS. So particularly people with serious mental illness. Research indicates that the experience of bereavement and loss tends to exacerbate their underlying mental illness. That makes sense to me. If they struggle with depression, they're going to have more depression. If they struggle with psychosis, they're going to have more delusions and hallucinations. It's going to disrupt that process. And people with SMI tend to experience severe prolonged grief in higher numbers than the general population, and then even higher numbers if they're residing with the deceased person at the time of death or they have other co-occurring stressors, such as a substance or other addiction, or they're low socioeconomic, or they have poor health status, or they have few friends. So any other co-occurring stressor is also going to make this experience of grief much more challenging for a person with SMI. So people with a low socioeconomic status, this is actually a fairly substantial body of research about providing grief services in low-income communities. People with low socioeconomic status experience severe or prolonged grief in higher numbers in the general population. The reason why is not clear. It may be that they are more stressed about the co-occurring stressors, including income, money. Um, I think of all the people I've seen on the street with a car wash or a poster of their loved one taking donations for a funeral. They can't even afford the funeral expenses. The key role that person might have had in their family. So folks with low SES struggle, and they also struggle with transportation to get to the grieving services that we have at our agencies. So that's another thing is they need a lot more resources to help them grieve, and we need to locate grieving services in low-income communities. People who are homeless tend to have hidden grief and unrecognized grief. When we talk with our clients who are homeless, we typically ask them about resources and their coping skills, but how often do we ask them if they've lost somebody recently or what are the losses associated with being homeless? So they tend to have unrecognized grief. They tend to experience higher levels of anticipatory grief. So I've started grieving because I know I'm going to have this loss. Um, Actually, their death rate goes up when they're experiencing losses and homeless, and they have limited opportunities for processing grief because they're not connected to institutions. So, in working with folks who are homeless and folks with low SES, support them by the use of memorials, advocacy, trauma informed care. Those are the three big things. And memorials that don't cost a lot. Maybe they can't afford a funeral. And, I know during COVID, when funerals were delayed, families were horrified at this because they felt like they couldn't start their grieving until they had a funeral. Maybe they're never going to be able to afford a funeral, but what else can they do to memorialize that person if they have few resources? And I love Day of the Dead in the ofrendas. I've adopted that practice myself, and it really is a time for me to just stop and remember the people whom I've loved and the things that I've loved that I don't have anymore. And people who have limited social support experience severe and prolonged grief in higher numbers than the general population. And that's to be expected too, because they don't have anybody to talk to who knew that person, or knew what their goal was that they've lost, or the pet they've lost, or the status they've lost. They have fewer people to reminisce with, which is a very social activity. And so they also have poor outcomes. So there are some suggested activities to use with these populations and others who struggle with grief. Always, always, always use a trauma-informed approach. You've got to have that trauma-informed care information because folks who have experienced loss, they've experienced what we call little t trauma. Maybe not having an index loss or index trauma, such as criterion A for PTSD. So they might not meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, but they have experienced a huge loss. And so it's important to recognize that trauma type therapy and trauma informed approaches are going to be the lane that you want to stay in helping people deal with loss, particularly those with fewer resources. When you're working with an SMI population or low SES or homeless folks, increase your case management, your advocacy, and your frequency of contact while folks are grieving. And then work with clients to develop culturally appropriate activities that they can use to help them process their grief. Many people, again, in these populations have few funds, little social support, and no ties to community institutions, which is where we tend to do our active grieving activities. So be sure to connect them to those resources as best you can. So let's talk for a minute about hidden grief, or disenfranchised grief was the research term that was used. And we need to recognize that grief and loss can occur related to almost any issue. So these are the ones that tend to be hidden, that we don't ask about or talk about, or people socially don't or culturally don't talk about. Absolutely, infertility and miscarriages are a huge issue for women, and we seldom talk about that in terms of grief and loss. Death of an ex-partner. My kid's dad died. Well, you might not have been married to him for the last 20, 30 years even, but you still had that relationship with that person, and that's a loss. Loss of child custody. I wish we had the opportunity to talk with this more with the parents of the kids that we see who are in care. Death of a coworker. I recently had the loss of a really, really important person in my life who was a coworker and a friend, and it's like golly, we talk about it at work for a week and then we move on and it's not been enough for me. Loss of faith or loss of religion or spirituality or belief systems is huge. Death of an affair partner. Talk about hidden. This happened to a friend of mine. His dad's affair partner died, and his dad was inconsolable, and nobody could figure out why he was so sad until he finally came out and acknowledged it. Loss of a family connection. Maybe family moved away, or you can no longer engage with a family member because of their disrespect for your boundaries. Loss of role, loss of independence. These are all hidden losses. And so use your trauma informed approach with folks. Make sure you're using client centered practices and client centered care. Ask those questions to get at the culturally informed and meaningful practices for that person. You might need to see them a little more frequently than you used to, and you might need to engage in more advocacy and case management with folks in these categories. So let's take a deep breath. People do, we're recording this, I think on December the 12th, so right before the holidays. A lot of people experience more intensity of loss during the holidays, so be mindful of that for your clients and for yourselves. Engage in these cultural practices for yourself and encourage them in your families and in your communities for any losses they have experiences. So I'm not going to ask you to say what you learned this week, but I'm just going to say, see you next year. You're taking 2 weeks off, so these trainings will take 2 weeks off. We're going to come together again on January 7th. We're going to have a diagnosis workshop. Is it this or is it that? These categories have overlapping symptoms, and you will see clients having multiple diagnoses within these categories. So we're going to talk about the key places you can look at to discern between one and the other. So I hope you have a good afternoon, good evening, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.